What if I told you that for many traditional African societies, the idea of a linear, abstract, infinite future doesn't exist, and that the way we think of time, hours, the calendar, deadlines, isn't natural but historical? It was learned, it was imposed, and in many ways, it was colonized. I first got interested in this topic when I was making a short Instagram video about how the idea of African time is often associated with lateness or disorganization. And I wanted to show how this association isn't just ignorant or false, but it's actually epistemically violent. Because what's at stake isn't punctuality, it's the colonization of time itself. In her essay, A is for Africa Towards the Decolonization of Knowledge Production, Ugandan activist Sylvia Tamale reminds us that before capitalist modernity, many societies, not just in Africa, tied their sense of time to the rhythms of life and nature. The sun, the harvest, the rain, the markets, the ceremonies, those were clocks. Time wasn't an empty container to be filled. It was relational, it was cyclical, it was event-based, and it was a lived experience. And when I read this, it made so much sense to me why, when I'm planning something with a friend, we'll say we'll meet in the afternoon or the party will start in the afternoon. It doesn't matter whether the party will start at 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. What matters is the event of it being the afternoon. Or if we say we're going to meet at sunrise, it doesn't matter whether the sun will rise at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. What matters is the event of the sun rising. This idea that time isn't universal but culturally shaped has been explored by many African philosophers, most influentially by John Mbiti, the Kenyan theologian who in 1969 wrote the book African Religions and Philosophy, which I actually have right here. I have two of his books actually. And Mbiti proposed that for many traditional African worldviews, time is made up of events: what has happened, what is happening, and what is about to happen. And he called these dimensions Sasa, the now, the recent past, and the near future, and Zamani, the vast, endless past where all events eventually go on to settle. In other words, time isn't an independent line stretching endlessly into the future. It's something that people create and experience through action, through events, through community, through ceremony, and through ritual. But it's also important to understand where Mbiti was writing from. Because Mbiti was a theologian, he was studying the relationship between man and God. So when Mbiti says traditional African thought has virtually no future, he didn't mean that they weren't thinking about tomorrow. He meant that meaning, morality, and spirituality are grounded in the here and now, not in a distant heaven to be hoped for or hell to be feared. In that sense, time and faith are lived experiences, not deferred promises. And there's something that I forgot to say. I made a similar video like this a few months ago for my Instagram. But what I forgot to say here is that the point really, of course, isn't whether Mbiti got it right or wrong, but the main takeaway is that time is event-based, it's cyclical, and it's communal. And African traditional societies were some of the best planners because they realized something fundamental, that the golden age doesn't exist in an abstract future, but it already exists in Zamani. So things like death, inheritance, the changing of seasons, the coming and going of generations, empires, those are things that have already happened and they exist in Zamani. So we know that they must happen again. And so that's why we dream, we aspire, we plan, and we hope. So I just wanted to say that. Something else to note is that when we say African time, we're of course not taking Africa as a single story, but Mbiti himself gives a disclaimer and says that his work is meant as a general survey, using both general observation across Africa while giving specific illustrations that he mentions. It's also not possible to give an overview of all of Mbiti's work in one video, so I would just definitely recommend for you to read his work for yourself. But of course, Mbiti's work didn't go unchallenged. This idea of African perceptions of time is something African philosophers have been debating, questioning, critiquing, and expanding ever since. So I want to give a small literature review of what happened after Mbiti. So we start in the 70s and 80s. Henry Odera Oruka, through his Sage Philosophy project, argued that Mbiti relied too heavily on proverbs and ethnography. He said philosophy should also be found in critical reasoning, not just in collective culture. Kwasi Wiredu argued that Africa is too plural for one model to represent everyone. And Kwame Chechi, writing about the Akan in Ghana, showed how people use both linear and cyclical time, not as opposites, but as overlapping. So the question shifted from what is the African concept of time to how many concepts are there and how do they work. Then we moved to the 90s and the 2000s. In 1996, Kibujo Kalumba and John English published a book revisiting Mbiti's ideas. In 2005, Kibujo Kalumba wrote an article called A New Analysis on Mbiti's Concept of Time, and this was meant to defend Mbiti from some of the criticisms and say that event-based time can still make philosophical sense. It's not primitive or backward, it just reflects the reality that time doesn't exist without the events that give it life. Meanwhile, in On the Post-Colony, Achille Mbembe showed how time is actually entangled. The capitalist present, colonial past, and uncertain futures all overlap in often very messy ways. And later, feminist scholars added a crucial element that time itself is political. Who gets to rest? Who gets to dream of a future? Who is stuck waiting and who is allowed to move forward? Those are questions of power, not just chronology. So where does that leave us? Clearly, we can see that over many years and decades, the conversation of African temporality has kept on evolving. And honestly, the point isn't really whether Mbiti got it right or wrong. It's just to remind us that the Western linear model of time isn't the only one. There are other ways to tell time, through memory, through experience, through the slow unfolding of a story. So temporal disobedience is my way of exploring these alternatives. Temporalities that breathe instead of rush, remember instead of forget, and loop instead of climb. So I really believe the revolution is epistemic because it's not just about what we know, but also how do we know what we know. And if this video resonated with you, then I hope you'll come on this journey of temporal disobedience with me. We'll be exploring themes like Swahili time, prophecy, art, memory, and so much more. So asante kwa kutazama, tafakari hayo, and I will see you in the next video. Asante.